The forest of the Ardennes, December 1944. Snow fell quietly over the endless pines wrapping the land in a pale silence. The war in Europe was said to be nearing its end, yet here in this frozen corner of Belgium, something unsettling was about to unfold. Down the narrow, icy roads rolled columns of jeeps carrying American soldiers. Their flags fluttered faintly in the cold wind, their helmets dusted with frost. To the eye, they were ordinary GIs, the same men who had crossed France and were now pushing toward Germany. But to the ear, something was off. Their English felt stiff, their slang foreign. Their boots didn't fit quite right. When one of them was asked half-jokingly, "Who's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend?" he hesitated, and in that single pause, suspicion was born. They were not American at all. They were German infiltrators disguised as Allied troops' ghosts, moving among the living, sent on a mission unlike any other in the war. Behind this deception stood Otto Skorzeny, a man both admired and feared, the architect of Operation Greif, a plan to confuse, mislead, and tear at the fragile trust that held the Allied army together. And as the snow thickened, the line between friend and foe began to disappear. He was tall, almost unnaturally so, a towering figure whose presence seemed to fill any room he entered. His face was long and pale, marked by a thin scar that stretched from his ear to the corner of his mouth. For those who met him, it was the first thing they noticed, that scar and the steady gaze behind it. His name was Otto Skorzeny, and to his enemies, he would become known as the most dangerous man in Europe. But long before he became a shadow in Allied intelligence reports, Skorzeny was an engineer, a man of logic, mathematics, and precision. He was born in Vienna in 1908, in a time when Europe still believed it could recover from one war before falling into another. He was a duelist, a believer in discipline, and a product of an era that admired strength above all. That scar on his cheek wasn't a battlefield wound. It was a mark of student pride earned in a fencing duel, worn as a sign of courage. When the Second World War consumed Europe, Skorzeny joined the Waffen-SS, not out of blind loyalty, but because he saw in war the ultimate test of intellect and will. And unlike many of his comrades, he didn't dream of medals or titles. He dreamed of ideas, operations that would defy logic, strategies that turned weakness into advantage. That opportunity came in 1943. Benito Mussolini, Italy's dictator, had been captured and imprisoned high in the Apennine Mountains. Hitler wanted him back. No one dared to attempt it. No one except Skorzeny. He led a small commando team that landed gliders atop a mountain fortress, stormed the compound without firing a shot, and freed Mussolini in front of stunned Italian guards. Photographs of that mission spread like wildfire across Europe. In Berlin, Hitler personally decorated him and whispered, "You are the kind of man I need for the final victory." By 1944, that final victory was slipping away. The Allies had landed in Normandy. Paris was liberated. The Eastern Front was collapsing. And yet, in the midst of despair, Hitler was still searching for one last strike, a blow so unexpected it could divide the Allies and prolong the war. That was when he summoned Skorzeny. Inside the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's dark concrete headquarters, the air smelled of smoke and defeat. Generals spoke in cautious tones. Maps were covered in red arrows pointing toward Berlin. Skorzeny stood silently until Hitler turned to him. "You once rescued a man," the Führer said. "Now I want you to rescue a front." He then described the plan, a secret operation during the upcoming Ardennes offensive. German soldiers would dress as Americans, speak English, and slip behind Allied lines. They would misdirect convoys, change road signs, and spread false orders. The mission wasn't to conquer, but to confuse. Skorzeny listened carefully, though he knew what the order truly meant. Not a military strike, but a psychological one. To deceive, to sow fear, to make men doubt what was real. He was being asked to create a weapon made of illusion. Recruitment began immediately. Skorzeny's orders were to form a special brigade, Panzer Brigade 150, made up of soldiers who could speak English, preferably those who had lived or worked abroad before the war. Out of more than 2,500 volunteers, only about 150 spoke English fluently. Fewer than 50 could pass as native speakers. Training took place in abandoned barracks and forests east of the Rhine. The recruits practiced American slang, learned to curse like U.S. soldiers, and studied pocket guides on baseball in Hollywood. They even practiced walking the relaxed, confident stride of an American GI. One German instructor, after hearing a recruit mispronounce the word Buddy shouted in frustration. If you can't sound like them, you'll die like us. Mistakes were costly. To test their readiness, Skorzeny organized interrogation drills asking questions like, "Who won the World Series last year? What's the capital of Illinois?" Those who hesitated were dismissed. The rest were told the truth. If captured in enemy uniform, they would be executed as spies. And yet many stayed. Whether out of duty fear or fascination with their commander, they trusted Skorzeny's strange charisma, that quiet confidence that made even the impossible seem achievable. By November 1944, Panzer Brigade 150 was ready, or as ready as it could ever be. Rows of jeeps and tanks, repainted with white stars, stood waiting. American uniforms were stitched and resized. Documents, ration cards, and even cigarettes were forged with astonishing accuracy. Skorzeny walked through the camp one last time, inspecting the men. Their faces were tense, but their eyes burned with the thrill of the unknown. He paused before one of them and said softly, "Remember, your greatest weapon is not your gun. It's the belief that you belong." Outside, the snow was already falling, a cruel omen of the winter to come. In a few weeks, these men would enter the Ardennes not as Germans, but as ghosts wearing American faces. And in doing so, they would step into one of the strangest, most haunting chapters of the Second World War, a story where truth itself became a casualty. Dawn broke over the Ardennes on December 16, 1944, without warmth. The forest breathed frost, and the snow, untouched for days, lay heavy on the branches. From a distance came a low thunder, not of weather, but of artillery. The German army had launched its final gamble, the Ardennes offensive, the last great push of the war, remembered forever as the Battle of the Bulge. Amid the roar of tanks and the confusion of battle, Otto Skorzeny's Panzer Brigade 150 began to move. Unlike other units, these men carried a secret more dangerous than any weapon. They wore American uniforms, spoke American words, and drove captured jeeps repainted with white stars. They were not soldiers of conquest, they were infiltrators, hunters cloaked in the skin of their prey. Their orders were simple, but surreal: move behind enemy lines, cut telephone wires, change road signs, redirect convoys, and create as much confusion as possible. They would not win by firepower, but by illusion. At first, the plan worked with almost theatrical precision. Columns of genuine Allied trucks lost in the morning fog encountered Skorzeny's disguised teams. The Americans confidently waved them down, checked their papers, and sent them off in the wrong direction toward ambushes, mines, or dead ends. One team switched a road sign near Malmedy, pointing Bastogne the opposite way. Hours later, an entire column of supply vehicles found themselves trapped between German panzers. Another group slipped into a bridgehead, rewiring detonators so that Allied engineers destroyed their own crossings by mistake. To the German high command, these were small victories. To the soldiers in the field, they were seeds of chaos. Rumors began to spread quickly through Allied lines. The Germans are wearing our uniforms. They've captured our jeeps. They could be anywhere. The forest, already cloaked in mist, became a labyrinth of fear. Soldiers looked twice at every face, every badge, every jeep. Suspicion seeped into the air like cold smoke. One American sergeant later wrote in his diary, "It wasn't the shells or the tanks that scared me most. It was the idea that the man next to me might not be one of us." That was precisely the effect Skorzeny had intended. For the first time in the war, the Allies faced an invisible enemy, one that looked like themselves. In an age before digital communication, trust was the only thread that connected orders, movements, and survival. And now even that was unraveling. A simple command to move east could lead an entire battalion west into the jaws of the German offensive. Road markers were twisted compasses, useless in the fog, and every checkpoint turned into a theater of suspicion. The more the Americans tried to tighten their security, the deeper the paranoia grew. Military police began stopping everyone, soldiers, officers, even generals, asking questions that no spy manual could prepare for. Who won the World Series last year? What's your hometown team? What's the capital of Illinois? Anyone who hesitated too long was detained. At first, it seemed almost absurd, a war decided by baseball trivia. But behind the irony lay a deeper truth: the Allies no longer trusted their own uniforms. Meanwhile, Skorzeny's men operated in a haze of adrenaline and dread. They knew that being caught meant death. Under the laws of war, fighting in enemy uniform was a capital offense execution without trial. Yet they pressed on. In the eerie calm between bombardments, they changed signposts, sabotaged fuel depots, and whispered false orders at crossroads. Some began to feel the weight of what they were doing. A few questioned whether deception even for victory was worth the price of dishonor. One lieutenant reportedly murmured to another, "We've become ghosts, not of Germany of truth." By the fifth day, the trickery had spread far beyond the reach of Skorzeny's own control. Even where no infiltrators were present, fear of them paralyzed the Allied response. Entire units halted operations to verify each other's identities. Convoys delayed for hours, planes grounded, supply lines tangled. The deception had taken on a life of its own, a phantom that no one could see, yet everyone could feel. And somewhere in the woods, Skorzeny watched the chaos unfold, his expression unreadable. He was a soldier, yes, but also a student of human nature. And what he saw confirmed what he had always believed. The mind, he once said, is the most fragile battlefield of all. In the cold mist of the Ardennes, that battlefield was collapsing not from shells or fire, but from doubt. And for the men who fought there, it would become a lesson they would carry long after the snow had melted. In war, the dead are mourned. But those who lose their trust, they never find it again. Fear spreads faster than bullets. It needs no uniform, no command, only uncertainty. By the third week of December 1944, the Ardennes forest had become a web of suspicion. The Germans' deception Operation Greif had planted something more corrosive than explosives: doubt. At first, the reports seemed unbelievable. How could German infiltrators possibly move through Allied lines wearing American uniforms and driving American jeeps? But each new rumor carried a fragment of truth, and soon the impossible began to feel inevitable. Every soldier became a potential imposter. Every jeep on the road a possible trap. The once familiar stars and stripes, the very symbol of safety, now brought unease. To counter the threat, U.S. military police established strict checkpoints. Soldiers were stopped, questioned, and searched. But since the infiltrators looked and sounded so convincing, officers resorted to an unlikely weapon, questions only a real American would know. Who's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend, who won the World Series last year? What's the capital of Illinois? What team does Joe DiMaggio play for? It sounded absurd, a war filtered through baseball trivia and pop culture. But in the confusion, it worked. Those who stumbled or answered with hesitation were arrested. In the days that followed, hundreds, even thousands of American soldiers were detained on suspicion of being spies. Some were interrogated for hours. Others were held at gunpoint, trembling in disbelief. The paranoia reached so far up the chain of command that even General Omar Bradley, one of the most recognizable Allied leaders, was briefly detained when a nervous sentry didn't like his answers about the St. Louis Cardinals. The incident became legend, both comical and chilling, illustrating how deep the uncertainty ran. For many soldiers, the war had suddenly turned inward. It was no longer just about defeating the Germans, but proving they themselves weren't the enemy. One young private later wrote, "We stopped trusting faces. We started listening to voices, and even then we weren't sure." This was the silent victory of Skorzeny's plan. His infiltrators hadn't destroyed bridges or captured command posts, but they had shaken the foundation of Allied morale. By Christmas, the entire Western Front buzzed with suspicion. Military police shot at jeeps that failed to stop quickly enough. Officers carried secret identification codes in their pockets. Passwords changed daily. Even generals were forced to verify their identity by personal detail: their wife's name, their hometown, or the street they grew up on. In mess halls, soldiers whispered stories of imposters who had slipped through and sabotaged fuel dumps or cut telephone wires. Some of those stories were true. Most were not. But it didn't matter anymore. In war, perception becomes reality. And as the days passed, that perception hardened into fear. The irony was cruel. The real infiltrators, only a few dozen in total, had already been scattered, captured, or killed. But their legend had multiplied across the front, feeding an invisible hysteria. One American officer later admitted, "The Germans didn't need to keep sending spies. We were doing their job for them." The distrust spread beyond the battlefield. Reports reached London and Washington, warning that German agents might have infiltrated military headquarters or even political circles. Guards were doubled. Telephones were monitored. The Allies, victorious in numbers and technology, were losing a quieter, more personal war, the war for confidence. Even Skorzeny himself, hidden deep in his command post, could hardly have predicted how far his deception would ripple. He had intended a tactical disruption, a few days of confusion. Instead, he had created a psychological storm that consumed entire divisions. Some historians would later debate whether Operation Greif truly mattered to the outcome of the Battle of the Bulge. Militarily, it did little, but in human terms, it was devastating. It proved that fear could paralyze armies more effectively than any weapon. And somewhere among the white trees and frozen rivers, young soldiers began asking themselves questions that no commander could answer. If a man can wear my uniform, speak my language, and fight under my flag, then who am I supposed to trust? The war had entered a new dimension, one not measured in miles or victories, but in hearts and minds. And once that trust was gone, no battlefield could ever be the same again. By late December, the fog of war began to thin, not from the winter air, but from exposure. The masquerade of Operation Greif was collapsing. What had once been a whisper in the snow was now a hunt. Reports came in from across the Ardennes. Disguised soldiers captured false jeeps, stopped, and unfamiliar accents betrayed. The Americans, once paralyzed by paranoia, had learned to listen not to uniforms or words, but to tone, hesitation, and instinct. One evening near Malmedy, a convoy was stopped by men claiming to be U.S. engineers. Their story was convincing, but one of them made a small mistake. He called a car's hood a bonnet, a British term no American would use. Within hours, they were under arrest. The discovery spread quickly. At another checkpoint, an officer noticed a soldier's boots. They were German-issue resoled with American rubber, but cut differently. It was enough. The infiltrators were dragged into barns, questioned, and when their ruse was confirmed, executed on the spot. Under the Geneva Conventions, fighting in the enemy's uniform was considered espionage, not combat. No trial, no prison, only a wall, a bullet, and silence. In those final days of December, several captured teams from Skorzeny's Panzer Brigade 150 met that fate. They faced their end quietly, some saluting others, smiling faintly, as if the farce had finally ended. Among them was a 22-year-old radio operator named Franz, a boy from Cologne who had once dreamed of studying architecture. In his pocket, they found a scrap of paper with 3 English words written again and again, "Trust Bridge Home." No one ever knew what he meant. Back at headquarters, Skorzeny received the reports without expression. He had always known the risks. From the start, he told his men that if they were caught, they would die as spies, not soldiers. Still, the reality of it, the faces the youth the waist, carried a weight even he could not hide. One of his aides recalled that night. He read the list of names in silence, then folded the paper, lit a cigarette, and said only, "War always eats its own illusions first." For Skorzeny, deception had been both art and weapon. Yet here, amid the ruins of his own creation, he saw its cost. He had built a unit of phantoms men stripped of identity, fighting in borrowed skins. Now, one by one, those phantoms were vanishing into the snow, leaving nothing but confusion behind. Still, the operation continued in fragments. A few small groups, unaware their mission was doomed, pressed deeper into Allied territory. Some managed to sabotage telephone lines and fuel depots before being cornered. Others simply vanished, lost in the maze of forest roads and blizzards. When the Allies later combed through the region, they found empty jeeps, forged papers, and uniforms hanging from trees like discarded masks. The ghosts of Greif had melted away. And yet, even in failure, they had succeeded in something darker. The panic they unleashed outlived them. For weeks afterward, American soldiers shot at their own patrols in error. Entire columns were delayed. Commanders questioned one another, and the specter of the infiltrator haunted the army long after the last German disguise was burned. It's tempting to view Operation Greif as mere trickery and eccentric footnote in the grand narrative of war. But for the men who lived and died inside that lie, it was a moral abyss. To fight without a flag is to lose something more than life. It is to lose meaning. Those soldiers, German or not, had crossed an invisible line. They had become tools in a game that cared nothing for their names, their beliefs, or the truth. And yet, can one truly condemn them? If loyalty to one's country demands deceit, where does honor end and duty begin? These questions would linger long after the snow of 1944 had melted. Even Skorzeny himself in later interviews refused to justify or regret the mission. He would simply say, "It was war. I did what war demanded." But perhaps in that calm evasion lay the deepest admission of all that some victories, however clever, leave behind only ghosts. The forest of the Ardennes would hold those ghosts long after the soldiers were gone. Their footprints buried under snow, their borrowed uniforms rotting into earth. No graves, no medals, just echoes of men who had fought as shadows and died as strangers. And somewhere in that white silence history whispered a quiet truth. Deception may win a moment, but it never wins the soul. When the smoke began to clear over the Ardennes, what remained was not victory or defeat, but confusion. The forests were littered with burned jeeps, shattered signposts, and frozen bodies in both American and German uniforms. It was difficult to tell who had been who. The illusion had outlived the men who created it. For the Allies' operation, Greif became a haunting reminder that war was no longer about armies facing each other across clear lines. It was about perception, about what people believed to be true. The deception had collapsed militarily, yes. But psychologically, it had left a scar. Commanders across the front began to realize that the panic caused by a few dozen infiltrators had disrupted entire divisions. Orders were delayed supplies, misrouted bridges blown by mistake. Some American units had fired upon friendly forces simply because of a different accent, a misplaced badge, a wrong answer about baseball. Even after the last imposter was executed, the fear persisted. Every unknown voice over the radio carried suspicion. Every order required double verification. The Allies had won the battle, but they had learned painfully that even victory could tremble under the weight of doubt. Historians would later call Operation Greif one of the earliest examples of psychological warfare, a kind of conflict fought not for ground, but for control of the mind. In earlier wars, armies clashed with swords, then with guns. But here in the frozen forests of Belgium, the weapon was belief itself. The Germans had not needed to destroy bridges, they had only to make the enemy believe they might. And belief was enough. The concept fascinated post-war scholars. Military academies would later study the event as a model of cognitive manipulation, the power to alter perception without firing a shot. But to the soldiers who lived it, there was nothing academic about it. It was personal. Many veterans of the Battle of the Bulge would say even years later that they never looked at their comrades the same way again. One American lieutenant recalled, "After Greif, I stopped seeing uniforms. I started seeing eyes trying to decide who was real." That was the invisible wound of Operation Greif. Unlike shrapnel, it couldn't be removed. It lingered, reshaping how men understood trust authority and even themselves. For the Germans who took part, the mental toll was equally deep. Some confessed after the war that living under a false identity had hollowed them from within. They had become, in their own words, actors in a play we didn't believe in. A few tried to justify it. "We did what soldiers do, we obeyed." Others weren't so sure. One former Greif operative decades later told a historian, "It's strange I survived, but I don't know who I was surviving for." Their deception had succeeded far beyond their orders. It had exposed a terrifying truth about the human condition, that identity once tampered with does not easily heal. In the decades after the war, the term psychological operations, or psyops, would become commonplace. Nations would learn that to control the mind was to control the outcome. Propaganda, misinformation, disinformation. All these modern strategies could trace part of their lineage back to the winter of 1944, when a handful of men dressed as Americans proved that fear was a stronger weapon than steel. And yet, there was something tragically human in that revelation. The soldiers on both sides were not philosophers or tacticians. They were young men in the snow, longing for warmth, for home, for certainty. What they found instead was the fragile boundary between reality and belief. In that boundary, trust died quietly, like breath in the cold. When the Ardennes thawed months later, the roads once marked by false signs led again to peaceful towns. But the people who had marched through them would never be the same. For them, Operation Greif was more than a mission or a deception. It was a mirror showing how easily humanity can be fooled not by others, but by itself. And perhaps that is the cruelest victory of all, when the war inside the mind continues long after the guns have gone silent. The war ended, but the ghosts of Operation Greif did not rest. When the guns fell silent in 1945 and the last embers of the Reich turned to ash, Otto Skorzeny found himself not on a battlefield, but in a courtroom. He stood in the dock at Nuremberg, accused of violating the laws of war by using enemy uniforms and deception. To his left sat officers who had overseen death camps. To his right, generals whose armies had burned half of Europe. Compared to them, his crime seemed abstract, a matter of disguise and illusion. But behind that illusion lay something deeper, the moral fracture of modern warfare. During the trial, witnesses described how Skorzeny's men had infiltrated Allied lines, how they had sown panic and confusion. The prosecution called it treachery. Skorzeny, however, was calm. He argued that his soldiers had never fired a shot while wearing American uniforms that they had changed into their own before engaging in combat. He cited historical precedent, quoting British commandos who had used enemy insignia during earlier missions. In the end, the tribunal acquitted him. The judges ruled that deception itself was not a war crime, only acts of violence committed under disguise. When the verdict was read, Skorzeny smiled faintly. He had escaped the noose once again. But freedom did not bring peace. In post-war Europe, Skorzeny became a figure of shadow, part myth, part man. He escaped from an internment camp in 1948, allegedly with the help of sympathetic guards, and fled to Spain, where General Franco granted him refuge. There he reinvented himself as an engineer businessman, and quietly a consultant in the new world of espionage that was emerging between East and West. The Cold War had begun, and deception, his old art, was in demand once more. Rumors swirled that he advised intelligence services across Europe, and perhaps even in the Middle East. Some claimed he worked briefly with Egypt to train commando units. Others, more astonishingly, said he collaborated with Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, helping them locate former Nazis in exchange for quiet immunity. If true, it was the final twist of irony, the man once hailed as Hitler's favorite commando, now serving his enemies in the secret wars of a divided world. To his admirers, he remained a daring strategist, bold, loyal, efficient. To his critics, he was a cynic, a man who saw war not as tragedy, but as theater. In interviews, Skorzeny was polite, but evasive. When asked about Operation Greif, he neither glorified nor denied it. He simply said, "War is a state of organized deceit. I only organized it better." He died in 1975 in Madrid of cancer. No flag draped his coffin. No nation claimed him. Yet men in dark suits attended his funeral quietly from both sides of the Iron Curtain. To them, Otto Skorzeny was not a relic, he was a teacher. His methods, infiltration, disinformation, the manipulation of fear, had become the language of modern intelligence. Long before the age of cyber warfare and propaganda networks, Operation Greif had written the first lines of that dark playbook. And so his legacy lived on, not in monuments or medals, but in the hidden machinery of power, in the understanding that truth itself could be weaponized. Some historians would later argue that Skorzeny's acquittal marked a turning point, a silent acceptance that deception was now part of the fabric of war. From that moment on, the battlefield was no longer just a place of blood and soil, but of belief. Yet beyond the tactics and the secrecy, there remains the question that haunted those who studied him. Was Skorzeny a visionary soldier ahead of his time, or simply a man who mistook cunning for courage? There is no simple answer. History rarely offers one, but standing in the shadow of the Ardennes, one truth endures. For every soldier who fights in daylight, there will always be another moving through darkness, shaping the war not with bullets, but with lies whispered in the fog. Otto Skorzeny understood that better than anyone, and perhaps that is why even now his name echoes not as a hero or a villain, but as a warning. Because the moment humanity learns to disguise its violence in the language of logic and honor, the war inside the mind never truly ends. Today, the Ardennes stands quiet again. The forest breathes softly under the weight of time. Snow drifts through the trees, just as it did in that winter of 1944, covering the ground where men once marched, lied, and died. Beneath the frozen soil rest soldiers from both sides, German and American, real and disguised. Their uniforms have rotted away their faces long forgotten. Only the earth remembers who they truly were. No monument marks the place where Operation Greif unfolded. Perhaps that is fitting. For how does one memorialize a deception? How does one honor men who fought in borrowed skins, brave yes, but for a truth that was not their own? Yet their story endures not as a tale of glory, but as a mirror. It reminds us that war does not end when the guns fall silent. It lingers in mistrust in memory, in the quiet places where truth once stood. Otto Skorzeny called deception a weapon. History called it strategy. But for those who lived through it, it was something more intimate, a wound that never quite healed. In every war that followed, the shadow of Greif returned in propaganda and espionage, in the subtle art of making people doubt what they see. And so the ghosts remain not in the forest, but in us. Because once a lie learns to wear a uniform, it never truly takes it off.